empathy, saying sorry, and your PDA child or teen. So on today's Coffee with Casey, I want to tell you guys how I shifted from trying to teach empathy and worrying about my son having no empathy or emotions to long-term focus on providing accommodations and nervous system support so that he could access the part of his brain where empathy resides. So for today's Coffee with Casey, I'm going to be talking about that and telling you guys some stories. And while you're listening, feel free to drop in questions. Disclaimer, I had a migraine on Wednesday and I just recovered today in the wake of the migraine. So if I lose my words or am not quite as articulate or sharp as I normally am on these calls, please forgive me and know that I am in the wake of a migraine because #humaning is hard. Okay, so let's talk about it. So 3.5 years ago, when I had first moved to Michigan from Washington, D.C., I was a full-time caregiver for initially just my PDA son because I had put my 1-year-old in full-time daycare so I could just focus entirely on supporting Cooper. However, once the pandemic started, everybody was home and it was just me. So this was a very difficult time, as you guys can imagine, and there was a time when I was walking down the stairs with laundry that I was trying to fold, and I slipped on the stairs and hit my back and tailbone on these wooden stairs and sort of fell into the living room. And my 1.5-year-old was there, and so was my, at the time, 5.5-year-old PDA son. And what happened was the 1.5-year-old started screaming because he was scared that I had hurt myself, and I was crying, and I was not getting up. And my PDA son started laughing and making fun of me. And now I understand it as going into the funster response, right? Where he perceived threat and he was sort of equalizing and trying to get back to a place of nervous system safety. But what it felt like to me as a mother was that he was making fun of me, had no empathy, didn't care about me at all. And it was really just compounding this sensation as a mother. Hey, Lucky, so good to see you. He was compounding the sensation I had as a mother of no matter what I do, I'm failing, and I only get negative feedback, right? Starting when he was an infant, just couldn't soothe him. When I tried to soothe him, it would be screaming, crying, back arched. When he was about 4.5 years old, he said, stop saying that. When I would say, I love you, he would push me away when I would hug him, etc. So just constant negative feedback and this sensation that there wasn't any empathy there, that he didn't care about me and that there wasn't empathy. So this was a situation where I had hurt myself, not where he had hurt me. But there were many instances where he would punch me or kick me, whether it was intentional or not. Sometimes it was unintentional with not understanding where his body was in space and big reaction. Other times it was, a nervous system reaction where I would get hit, punched, or just verbal aggression, right? And during these years, understanding what I do about the brain, right, where this behavior is coming from is in this red part, which is the survival brain. But as a mother, even if I cognitively know, hey, this isn't under his control, it's not actually a reflection of how he feels about you, it sure feels bad as a mom. But during those years, I would not make him say sorry. And the reason for this is because I knew that the cost of making him say sorry would be nervous system activation, and the cost of cumulative nervous system activation, especially coming out of burnout, would be that he would continue to decrease his eating, decrease his speaking, and increase his behavior. So I could recognize that direct trade-off cognitively and with my rational brain, even if emotionally it felt like shit, okay? So there were years when I didn't make him say sorry. And I just kept having to trust the logic of the brain, right? Of like how this is actually working and how those moments and choice points are causally related to his overall nervous system well-being and what part of the brain he's operating in. Fast forward to this last summer, and lots of therapy in between, EMDR, lots of talk therapy, all the things to like rewire myself around this sensation and identity of like, I'm a bad mom, I just get negative feedback, he doesn't even want me to say I love you, etc. Fast forward to this past summer, and Cooper and I did a very special trip to work on our connection, which was, we did the Safe and Sound protocol together. Caveat, I could not have done this 4 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago. We had a solid foundation of trust. So like, I always hesitate to share therapies or things that I do because people are like, oh, that's the fix, right? But like, really, this is a sequential process, and without years of accommodating, this would not have happened. That's my caveat. So we were doing this nervous system healing together, and we were like working on our connection, and we were working with an occupational therapist. So we did some OT sessions, and in one of the OT sessions, he wanted to be in this dark room. He was sort of inside of Lycra materials, sort of like a birthing canal, and he was inside this ball pit with fluorescent lights, but the lights off. And he was sort of like coming out and going back in. And the therapist prompted me, like, why don't you join him? Because thematically, the 5 days, this was sort of like a rebirth. And so I got in, and he was just like coming out at the time when I was coming in, and he smashed his face into mine, and like I got a bloody lip and it hit my nose, and I just started crying because I was there for 7 days, just he and I in Colorado, and like I was doing all the caregiving, one-on-one attention, de-escalation, all the things. And I just sort of lost it, and like I didn't hear what had happened in the moment, but the therapist told me later that he said, I'm sorry, in the moment that it happened, but I was so activated I couldn't hear it. And so the therapist saw how upset I was and sort of prompted Cooper to say it again so that I could hear it. And he was like, I just said it, I'm not saying it, right? Because, you know, it's a loss of autonomy and putting oneself above a child, teen, individual to be like, you need to do this, right? And that's the only time in the 7 days both of us sort of stepped into that energy because we were both upset by what had happened. My mouth was bleeding and I was crying, right? So, but she told me later, like, he said, sorry, I heard it, etc. But I didn't feel that as a mother. Fast forward to Wednesday of this week when I had my migraine, which I mentioned on the beginning of this live. And sometimes I get migraines after I do like 2.5 hours of spot coaching live for the Paradigm Shift program, because I'm like, you know, I'm live with parents or coming off of mute, and I'm like staying regulated and like honing in all the things. And like, if I try and do something after that, and I know this now, like I will get a migraine. Like it's too much for my nervous system. But I didn't listen to myself, didn't listen to my own boundaries, got a migraine. The aftermath has been pretty terrible. And yesterday I woke up, yesterday's Monday, so you can see how long this lasted. And I woke up and I was just feeling terrible, and the kids were like screaming and making noise and like doing the things that kids do, right? Especially PDA kids. And my husband came home from the gym, and I was like telling him, like, he's like, are you okay? And I was like, no, the kids are so loud and like my head hurts, and I was reactive, right? And I heard Cooper say, he came over to me, he gave me a hug, he said, I'm sorry, Mama. And I was like, mind blown, because this is like after the course of years and years that he voluntarily said, I'm sorry. And I said, and I sort of snapped me back into my thinking brain, and I was like, oh honey, like, you know, kids are allowed to be loud. Like, mommy just had a headache. You don't need to apologize for that. But it just was like this full circle moment where he actually said, I'm sorry, and demonstrated empathy, right? Which is for so long something that I had to trust was there. However, I didn't see or feel it as a mother. And so what I want to say here is that so often we're focused on like we need to teach them empathy or they don't have empathy, but rather what's really going on is that when they have cumulative nervous system activation, they're really just existing from that red part of the brain, which is the downstairs brain or the survival brain, where we can't access empathy, right? And so the accommodation approach and all of these counterintuitive things, like not making your kids say sorry and trusting that they have empathy, they're just not in the part of the brain where they can access it, which is the frontal lobe. So, this story also demonstrates the degree of trust that we have to have with our kids, where we're watching them give us negative emotional feedback or not saying sorry in the moments that, they've made mistakes, hurt somebody, whether intentionally or based on the nervous system. However, over the long term, the more they're operating from the frontal lobe, the more we see the empathy that already exists. So that's the main point I want to make, is just like, I have felt for years, felt in my body, my son doesn't have empathy, even though cognitively I knew that it was there. But this recent migraine situation, it was one of the first times I got to feel what my brain knew to be true. So I wanted to share that story with you because I think it's hopeful. I think it illustrates one of the worries many of us parents have about our children not having empathy. I know not all of you have that worry because some of our kids are more snuggly or say I love you or more verbal, giving verbal affirmations, but a lot of us have kids like mine who don't do that. All right, so that was my story. That was the topic I wanted to start off on, and I'm here to answer a couple questions for Coffee with Casey. I actually have my green smoothie instead of coffee, trying to work on that migraine. But I don't see any questions yet. I love it when I see people I know pop up here. Usually my mom's on, but I don't see her yet. I do see a friend from Australia, which is awesome. Melanie says, so relatable. Yes, I think it is relatable because, it's hard when you get hurt, especially if your PDA kid causes the injury and then laughs in your face. Like, it's hard to maintain your compassion and composure in those moments because you're, physically hurt and someone is laughing at you in a way that makes you feel activated and alone. Okay. How to manage the younger child. So that question is like way too broad for me to understand what to answer. I think according to the questions I usually get, there's usually two primary questions people ask, which is do you use the same parenting approach for both kids, and how do you manage sibling dynamics? So those are two separate questions. Both of them have to do with the cost-benefit framework that I teach in the Paradigm Shift program. So there are 12 primary accommodations that I teach and include in my podcast and the tiles, but really focus on in the Paradigm Shift program. So I use all those same 12 accommodations with my younger for almost 5-year-old now who is not PDA. However, the cost-benefit decision-making around boundaries is different for my 4.5-year-old, right? So boundaries and limits really have more to do with decisions than they do with accommodations. The accommodation, when you set a boundary, becomes how to de-escalate and diffuse the inevitable nervous system response. So if you have a follow-up question that's more specific, feng shui, I said that right, then I'm happy to answer it. Why is my child so defiant no matter what I ask? Okay, so I think your name is Cuntify, which I hope that's actually what it is. Cuntify. Yeah, great name. So if your child is PDA, then there's a couple things that could be going on. One is PDA children are constantly on a subconscious level, like not their conscious awareness, perceiving that they're going to die, put simply, right? Because every time that red part of their brain, which we all have, it's the survival part of their brain, perceives that they don't have freedom and choice, or that they don't, they perceive someone, something, some situation is above them and not equal to them, their survival brain, their neuroception, tells their nervous system, hey, you're going to die. And they go into fight, flight, or freeze, right? So when we see defiance, that's often that fight, flight response, which is what our bodies would do if there was a lion in front of us, of like, the lion's growling, we're the antelope, and we have three choices, like, not choices, we have three evolutionarily ingrained responses that happen much faster than our rational thought, which is like, we can flee the lion, we can fight the lion, we can play dead. Our body plays dead so the lion doesn't eat dead prey. So if your child has more of a fight response, which is more externalized, then they are going to be showing it with the safest person, right? So for example, if your child is going to school all day and internalizing that threat response, the antelope that is like playing dead, looking compliant and fine at school, they're still experiencing that nervous system activation, but once their brain perceives they're truly safe around you, it will come out as soon as they get home, and any stimuli, any interaction, any like, hey, do you want to watch a show? Hey, do you want to play? What do you want for dinner? It will just be threat response, threat response, threat response, because it's cumulative. The second reason is anytime we ask our children direct questions, right? Like, how was your day? How did you sleep? What do you want for breakfast? Do you want to go to the park? Every time we ask that direct question, they're perceiving on a subconscious level a loss of autonomy because they weren't necessarily expecting the question, and the perception that you're above them or in a position of power because you're the one who asked the question. Right? So direct questions and initiating speaking to a PDA child, especially if they have high cumulative nervous system stress already, is going to result in fight responses like stop talking, growling, hissing, throwing things, calling you names, saying shut up, swearing. Right? So it's an indicator that your child is at their threshold of how much their nervous system can take before they're just having fight-flight responses constantly. So something we can do, hold on, to deal with this question specifically is use declarative language. So I know this is backwards, but the Declarative Language Handbook is a really good resource for parents of PDA children and teens, and it helps you reframe your language. Instead of using questions, we can use declarative sentences like, I notice you don't have your shoes on, or even statements about yourself like, oh, it looks really cold out there. I saw some snow yesterday. I'm going to have to get out my winter coat, right? Instead of being like, you need to put on your coat, which is an imperative, or did you put on your winter coat? So that's just one of many accommodations we can use. So declarative language is one of the language and connection accommodations that we can lean into as parents. Okay, can you tell us a bit more about how OT can help? Okay, so as I said earlier in this live, like I'm always very hesitant to talk about therapy. And I'll tell you why. It's not because I'm against therapy, and actually like some of my son's therapists have been the most transformational nervous systems in his life. However, if we're seeking answers and seeking an expert to tell us or know how to interact with our child, we're often going to find ourselves in situations where therapy can be counterindicative, meaning most therapists, not all, right? If you have a trauma-informed therapist, if you have a DIR floor time therapist, some play therapist, or truly into neurodiversity affirming therapist, unless you have someone who really gets that like nervous system safety is the goal, the relationship and the connection is the goal, which is hard with insurance, You're gonna have therapists who, even if they're great at first, they're like, okay, let's establish trust, let's establish connection, and then they move towards skills. And as soon as they start pushing the kid through skills, even if it's gentle, the child or the teen is going to perceive that they're putting themselves above them with their agenda, and they're going to have a threat response. And so it counteracts any sensory skills or speech skills or gross motor skills that you're trying to work on, because all of that is mediated by the nervous system, right? So if the nervous system is activated, therapy is not going to help, and it's going to make things worse. Additionally, if we're too early in our journey, where we push children or teens to go to therapy when we haven't established trust, consent, and autonomy between us, parents, and them, then we're going to get resistance to therapy, nervous system activation in the therapy, and it's going to be counterindicative. That being said, the occupational therapists that I have worked with have been incredible because they have worked through the premise of like the relationship is what's therapeutic, right? So it's not skills based, and there's lots of autonomy, there's lots of accommodations baked into the therapy itself. So the way I view it is like it's a 1 hour safe space that exists outside of my home, and there's another nervous system I can depend on besides my own to signal safety. So if the child has autonomy and the therapist is not pushing skills and really focusing on like a special interest. So for example, at OT right now, we're really focused on football. So like we just play football, me, the therapist, and then in that setting, she strews or gives visual cues of offerings that might help him with some of his goals of plans of care, right? Like, oh, I'm going to lay out this football drill and see if he crosses the midline. But if he doesn't want to do it, we just drop it. So it's a very long-term relationship-based approach where like the skills come organically rather than like, here, we're going to come into the therapy setting and here's our laminated chart and we're going to like do these exercises that cross the midline. So I hope that makes sense. In my link in bio, you can look at a list of PDA affirming therapists in North America. How do I support my son when he's making it through the day but exploding and treating me terribly at home? Okay, so this is a very common dynamic and one I've experienced myself, and I know how hard it is. It's crazy making and nobody believes you and you feel like a terrible parent. The first thing I want to say is, on a deep level, even though I know you feel like your son is at his worst with you and this is negative feedback that makes you feel like a bad mom, it's actually a reflection of the fact that he's likely internalizing his activation at school or masking because he's not perceiving on a subconscious level that it's like totally unconditionally safe, right? Which is true about school versus home with you. So he's going to come home and all that accumulation is going to come out with the safest or the weakest person, or both, right? So usually it's the lead parent who's the safest, the weakest is often a sibling. So you get equalizing behavior, which is like that reflexive behavior, which feels like being treated terribly, being controlled, abusive behavior, to get back to a place of nervous system safety. Okay, so that's what's going on. Doesn't make it any easier necessarily, but just to understand in terms of your identity as a mom that it's not like your fault and he's not a bad kid. It's just he's reaching his threshold and then coming home to a safe space. So there's two ways to think about it. One is like we can really lean into accommodations at home to offset that nervous system activation at school to bring down the nervous system stress, which includes like looking at that type of behavior and being like, it's a nervous system disability, like this is equalizing, it's not personal, it's an indicator of cumulative nervous system activation, and then diffuse, which is really hard for parents, especially if they're earlier on in the journey, which might mean like, you know, he walks in as like, why didn't you pack X, Y, and Z in my backpack? Like, you're stupid. This is your fault, right? And you're like, A, what are you talking about? B, if there was something you were supposed to do, it's your responsibility, etc. But what is diffusion? You're just like, okay, not motivated behavior. It is activating my nervous system, but I can take a sacred pause and understand that this is what he's doing to get back to a place of safety. So I might stay non-reactive, not try and explain or correct in the moment, or I might say, yeah, like that must have been super frustrating to not have your stuff in your backpack, right? And like, you can use humor. There's all sorts of ways we can diffuse, but then we have other ways of like lowering demands, using humor, declarative language, signaling safety mammal to mammal at home that can offset the accumulation at school. However, if we work through an accommodation lens and even if we bring down activation over the long term, you know, I would say like 3 to 6 months of intensively focusing on that and truly doing it, that might not get him below his threshold enough to stop the equalizing behavior, in which case we have to move to the decision-making part of things and look at the cost-benefit analysis of like, is it worth the activation and the behavior at home and how it impacts his basic needs and our connection to have him at school experiencing all of that activation. And if it's not worth it, then we can explore things like advocacy, we can explore things like communicating about more support at school, etc. And this is complex. This is all included in the Paradigm Shift program, but it is about accepting the constraints of our children's nervous system so that we can make decisions to get unstuck. Oh, Feng Shui with me says, but he has no feelings. Well, I believe that your son has feelings, but you don't see emotions when you're just in a survival response. When you're in the red part of your brain, it's not the emotional part of the brain in the sense of like naming feelings, connecting, accessing empathy that you get in the frontal lobe. It's just the nervous system response happening in the body and the reflexive output that comes from that, right? And this is why a lot of strategies that try and name feelings with PDAers don't work, because it's not actually a feeling. Like, he's not actually mad. It's just the fight response. So that is a sticking point I see a lot with families. When standing between two kids in conflict, being aggressive, what do I say? I can be calm, but what do I say? Well, it depends on the situation. I mean, I might say, if it were my kids, I'm just putting myself in your situation. What I would say depends on like the level of trust and connection you guys have, how long you've been working through the PDA lens, what the neurotypes of the two kids are, and how far in or out of burnout the kid is. It depends on if you're going to set a boundary. If you're going to set a boundary, you might say, you know, I'm going to move your body now, or I'm going to move you over here, or William and I are going upstairs, right? Declarative sentence, setting a boundary. If you're in the like risk mitigation where like you need to actually do something because someone's going to get hurt, right? If you're in de-escalation mode, it can be like, I know this is hard for your body right now. But that's not going to make the reaction go away. It might soften it, but like in a situation where two kids are in conflict, we're talking less about like, what can I say to make this not be activating? We can soften it with declarative language, but it's more of like cost-benefit decision-making. Do I set a boundary? If I set a boundary, then I need to move into like de-escalation mode. But yeah, when my kids are hurting each other, sometimes I have to set a boundary and move the body of one of them, right? Especially the little one, of like, I'm going to take you upstairs, you know, Mommy and William are going to read a book in our room. And I know some of you at this stage in your journey have a PDA who's so activated that they're going to follow and kick the door and, you know, like try and, they're not going to take the boundary as like a boundary. And that's more of a reflection of cumulative nervous system activation. So like in the moment, I can't stop cumulative nervous system activation. It's a reflection of the nervous system. So like I have to look at my lifestyle and all of the accommodating I'm doing so that they don't get to that point over time. I know that's unsatisfying. How do I get my son help for this? It's been 100% since he was an infant. Yeah, I mean, I'd start with 2 places. We have a free clarity masterclass to help you determine whether an accommodation framework would fit your child's neurotype, which is in the link in bio. And then there's also, if you're in North America, a list of PDA affirming practitioners who is somewhat vetted by PDA North America. So that's where I would start if you believe that this is your child. All right, I'm going to jump off because my little Fitbit buzzed and I don't want to get another headache, but it was nice to be with you guys today, and I hope you have a good Halloween if you're celebrating. All right, bye.